My oldest son called me at midnight. He is a lead agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not say hello. He told me to turn off every light in my house immediately. He ordered me to climb into the attic lock, the reinforced steel hatch, and absolutely not tell my daughter or her husband. I whispered that he was scaring me. He shouted at me to just do it. I obeyed his command. Through a narrow ventilation grate in the attic floor, I witnessed a conversation that instantly erased 38 years of a father's love. I saw my own flesh and blood calmly planning my execution for a payout. Before I explain exactly how I turned their flawless criminal conspiracy into a federal trap, tell me where you are watching from in the comments section. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe greed is the ultimate destroyer of families. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour. It was exactly 43 minutes past 11 at night. I sat in my leather armchair reading a biography of early American industrialists. The house was entirely silent. My secure landline suddenly shattered the quiet. I only give that specific number to my children for absolute emergencies. I picked up the heavy receiver expecting to hear my daughter Rachel complaining about a broken pipe in the guest house across the lawn. Instead, I heard the tense and rapid breathing of my oldest son, Michael. He works in the white-collar crime division in Washington. He did not ask how my evening was going. He delivered a sequence of rapid and non-negotiable commands. He told me to stand up immediately. He ordered me to turn off every single light on the ground floor. He instructed me to manually check the deadbolts on the front and back doors. He then told me to climb the stairs to the second floor, pull down the attic ladder, climb inside, and throw the heavy deadbolt on the hatch. I stood up from my chair, feeling a cold spike of adrenaline in my chest. I asked him what was happening. I reminded him that I am 70 years old and my knees do not appreciate midnight gymnastics. Michael did not laugh. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. He stated that a federal wiretap had just intercepted an active threat. He confirmed the threat did not come from a random criminal syndicate. The intercepted communication originated directly from the internet routing address assigned to my own guest house. That guest house was currently occupied by my daughter Rachel and my son-in-law Brian. Michael commanded me to stay completely silent. He ordered me to observe everything and engage with no one. The line went dead before I could ask another question. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. My mind raced through the possibilities. A forensic accountant spends his entire career looking for hidden anomalies in spreadsheets. I am trained to remain calm under pressure. I walked systematically through the living room and switched off the brass reading lamp. I moved into the kitchen and turned off the overhead lights. The house plunged into absolute darkness. I checked the heavy brass deadbolt on the oak front door. It was secure. I checked the sliding glass doors leading to the patio. They were locked tight. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my hands remained entirely steady. I approached the wooden staircase leading to the second floor. I moved through the dark hallway, relying entirely on my memory of the house. I built this place 40 years ago. I know every contour and every flaw in the wood. I intentionally bypassed the third step from the top. That specific wooden board always lets out a loud groan when any weight is applied to it. I stepped over it silently. I reached the second floor landing. The moonlight filtered through the large window at the end of the hall. I reached up and grabbed the hanging cord for the attic ladder. I pulled it down with a smooth and practiced motion. The springs whined softly, but the sound was negligible. I climbed the wooden rungs carefully. My joints ached in protest, but the fear of my son's warning pushed me upward. I hoisted myself into the dusty darkness of the attic space. I immediately turned around and pulled the ladder up behind me. I pushed the heavy wooden hatch back into place. I reached out in the dark and found the cold metal of the heavy deadbolt. I slid the thick steel bar into the reinforced strike plate with a solid click. I installed that specific commercial-grade lock exactly 10 years ago. A string of aggressive home invasions had swept through our rural county. My son-in-law, Brian, constantly mocked me for installing it. He called me a paranoid old man wasting his retirement money on useless security features. He claimed nobody would ever bother robbing a retired accountant living in the woods. Now that heavily criticized lock was the only physical barrier keeping me safe. I crawled across the fiberglass insulation panels. I ignored the scratchy fibers digging into the palms of my hands. I made my way toward the center of the attic floor. I positioned myself directly over the large cast-iron ventilation grate that looks down into the main dining room. The house remained dead silent for another 10 minutes. I controlled my breathing to ensure I made absolutely no sound. Then I heard the sharp metallic click of the front door deadbolt turning downstairs. Someone possessed a key to my home. The heavy oak door swung open with a soft creak. I pressed my face against the cold iron of the grate and looked down into the shadows of my own dining room. I expected to see men in ski masks holding weapons. I expected to see hardened criminals tearing through my cabinets for jewelry or cash. Instead, the dining room chandelier suddenly clicked on and flooded the room with harsh yellow light. I looked down and saw Brian. He was wearing his expensive designer jacket. He was carrying a massive, heavy canvas duffel bag over his right shoulder. My daughter Rachel followed right behind him. She was wearing her soft cashmere sweater. She carefully locked the front door behind them and peered nervously out the front window before drawing the heavy curtains. The conflict ignited immediately. Rachel walked directly to the mahogany dining table and dropped a thick manila folder onto the polished wood. She spread a series of complex legal documents across the table. I recognized the formatting immediately. They were commercial real estate transfer deeds. Brian dropped the heavy canvas duffel bag onto one of the dining chairs. He unzipped the top of the bag and reached inside. He began pulling out thick, tightly wrapped stacks of $100 bills. He tossed the bundles onto the table next to the legal documents. He then pulled out 3 cheap plastic burner phones and set them aside. The sheer volume of the cash was staggering. It looked to be at least $500,000 in untraceable currency. Brian leaned over the table and tapped the documents with his index finger. He excitedly told Rachel that the Shell Corporation accepted the forged signatures without a single question. He stated that the anonymous buyers did not care about the legal irregularities as long as they secured the deed to my pristine 60-acre property. The cash on the table was their illegal advance payment. Brian owed catastrophic debts to people who do not use collection agencies. He planned to use my land to save his own miserable life. Rachel picked up one of the cash bundles and thumbed through the crisp bills with a look of pure, unadulterated greed. She did not express any guilt about stealing her father's only major asset. She only expressed anxiety about the timeline. Brian assured her the buyers were bringing the final notary on Thursday evening to finalize the transfer. Rachel nervously mentioned that I would notice the property surveyors on the land before Thursday. Brian smiled and told her she needed to handle the medical issue tomorrow morning. Rachel nodded coldly. She casually mentioned that she had already acquired the undetectable beta blockers from a corrupt pharmacist she knew. She stated her exact plan to crush the pills into a fine powder. She planned to slip that powder into my morning bowl of oatmeal. She explained to Brian that the medication would trigger a massive localized stroke in my brain. It would not kill me outright, but it would instantly render me completely incapacitated and unable to speak. That specific medical event would allow them to legally activate the secret medical power of attorney they had fraudulently filed with the county clerk last week. They would gain absolute legal control over my body and my assets before noon. They were not just stealing my property. They were planning to imprison me inside my own failing body to ensure I could never testify against them. I listened to my daughter discuss my permanent paralysis with the same casual tone she used to discuss the weather. I did not gasp. I did not cry. The shock evaporated from my system and was immediately replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my life destroying fraudulent empires with paper trails and undeniable evidence. I slowly reached into my chest pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen and opened the camera application. I switched the settings to the highest resolution available. I carefully positioned the camera lens directly through the gaps in the iron grate. I pressed the red button and began recording their entire treasonous conversation in crystal-clear video and audio. I captured their faces. I captured the stacks of illegal cash. I captured the forged documents on the table. I captured my daughter explicitly confessing to an elaborate plot of attempted murder. I held the phone perfectly steady. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The morning sun broke through the heavy wooden louvers of the attic vents, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty floorboards. I had not slept a single minute during the night. I spent the dark hours mentally cataloging every asset, every account, and every legal document attached to my name. Despite the physical exhaustion that usually accompanies a man of my age, I felt an absolute and terrifying clarity. I waited patiently until I heard the faint, familiar grind of the coffee maker downstairs in the kitchen. I knew Rachel was awake. I carefully unlocked the heavy commercial deadbolt on the attic hatch. I lowered the wooden ladder with slow, practiced movements to avoid making any noise. I descended into the second-floor hallway and moved silently into the master bathroom. I washed my face with ice-cold water, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Today was the day I would sit down and dine with my own executioners. I reached into my leather travel kit and extracted a thick, heavy-duty plastic storage bag. I folded the plastic meticulously until it was completely flat. I slid the folded bag high up the left sleeve of my heavy flannel shirt, securing it tightly against my forearm with a thick rubber band. I walked down the wooden staircase with the slow, measured steps of a tired old man who was entirely unaware of his impending doom. I pushed open the swinging wooden door to the kitchen. The warm smell of roasted coffee beans and ground cinnamon filled the air. I had built this kitchen with my own hands 30 years ago. I installed the oak cabinets and laid the slate tile floor to create a warm environment for my family. Now that same room was the staging ground for my murder. Rachel stood near the gas stove. She wore a pristine white linen apron over her designer clothes. She turned toward me and offered a smile so wide and seemingly full of genuine affection that it physically turned my stomach. She cheerfully announced that she was making my favorite steel-cut oatmeal to help me start the day right. She poured a generous amount of expensive maple syrup over the steaming pot and stirred it slowly with a wooden spoon. I knew exactly what else she had mixed into that breakfast. I knew the fine white powder of the crushed beta blockers was currently dissolving in the hot oats. Brian sat comfortably at the center granite island. He was aggressively typing on one of the cheap plastic burner phones I had seen him unpack the night before. He quickly flipped the phone face down against the stone counter the moment I entered the room. He picked up his ceramic coffee mug and loudly began complaining about an upcoming golf trip with his former college friends. He lied effortlessly about the early morning tea times and the exorbitant luxury resort fees. He complained about the cost of the trip as if he were not actively planning to steal $4 million from me by nightfall. I did not interrupt his performance. I simply nodded politely and sat down at my usual spot at the head of the long dining table. Rachel walked over and placed the steaming ceramic bowl directly in front of me. She set a polished silver spoon on a neatly folded linen napkin beside my right hand. She placed a gentle, warm hand on my shoulder. She leaned down and told me in a sickeningly sweet voice to eat every last bite so I could keep my strength up for the busy week ahead. The sheer audacity of her physical touch required every single ounce of my professional self-control to tolerate. I looked down at the thick beige mixture in the bowl. It looked perfectly normal. It looked exactly like the hundreds of warm breakfasts my late wife used to prepare for me on cold winter mornings. I picked up the silver spoon and slowly stirred the hot oatmeal. I intentionally let the metal spoon clink loudly against the sides of the ceramic bowl. Brian glanced over from his seat at the kitchen island. He urged me to eat it quickly while it was still hot. He stated with a cruel, hidden smirk that I needed a good heavy meal before the county property appraiser arrived later that afternoon. I knew he was referring to the cartel lieutenant, posing as a legitimate businessman. The tension in the room was absolute and suffocating. They were watching my hands with the predatory stillness of starving vultures waiting for a wounded animal to finally collapse in the dirt. I knew they were waiting for the moment my hand would suddenly drop the spoon. They were waiting for my face to go slack and for the stroke to paralyze the right side of my body. I needed to break their intense visual focus. I needed a distraction massive enough to pull both of them away from the table simultaneously. I slowly lowered the silver spoon back onto the linen napkin. I looked past Brian, directing my gaze through the large glass bay window that overlooked the circular concrete driveway. I purposefully squinted my eyes and leaned forward in my chair, pretending to struggle with my vision. I asked Brian in a confused tone if he had recently changed the oil in his new German sports car. Brian scoffed arrogantly. He proudly stated that the luxury dealership handled all the maintenance on his expensive lease and that he never touched the engine himself. I raised a trembling finger and pointed directly toward the glass. I told him in a highly concerned, wavering voice that a massive pool of thick black fluid was rapidly expanding underneath the engine block. I added that it looked like the dark oil was flowing directly toward the newly poured white concrete of the driveway. Brian practically jumped out of his expensive leather barstool. That leased sports car was his ultimate status symbol. It was the only tangible proof of his fake wealth and his fragile ego. He dropped his coffee mug onto the granite counter with a loud, violent clatter. He shouted a sharp curse word and sprinted past the island toward the bay window. Rachel gasped loudly and immediately followed him. She completely abandoned her watchful post by the stove. They both pressed their faces against the cold glass, frantically trying to assess the imaginary mechanical disaster waiting in the driveway. I had exactly 5 seconds to execute my countermeasure. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a moment. I pulled my left arm back sharply. I snapped the thick rubber band and released the plastic storage bag from my flannel sleeve. I grabbed the steaming bowl of poisoned oatmeal with my right hand. I tipped the heavy ceramic bowl over the open plastic bag. I used the silver spoon to scrape every last drop of the lethal mixture inside. The hot, sticky oatmeal slid perfectly into the bottom of the bag. I immediately pinched the heavy-duty zipper shut, sliding my fingers across the top to ensure it was completely airtight and secure. I shoved the warm plastic bag deep into the hidden inside pocket of my thick wool cardigan. I reached across the table and grabbed the open cardboard box of dry bran flakes sitting near the fruit bowl. I poured a large mound of the dry cereal directly into the empty ceramic bowl. I grabbed the small pitcher of milk and splashed a minimal amount over the top of the flakes. I immediately shoved a large spoonful of the dry cereal into my mouth. The entire physical maneuver took exactly 4 seconds from start to finish. I crunched the dry flakes loudly just as Brian turned away from the window. His face was flushed with a mixture of extreme confusion and rising anger. He aggressively stated that he did not see any oil leak at all. He marched back toward the kitchen island, loudly muttering insults about my failing eyesight and my declining mental state. Rachel followed close behind him, casting a highly nervous and scrutinizing look in my direction. She immediately looked down at the table. She saw the empty sides of the ceramic dish and the large mound of half-eaten dry cereal floating in the milk. I smiled brightly at her. I told her the oatmeal was absolutely delicious, but I decided I needed a little extra crunch this morning to wake myself up. I swallowed the dry flakes with a loud gulp and took a long, satisfying sip of my black coffee. Rachel stared at the bowl for a long moment. She let out a long, silent breath of relief that visibly dropped her shoulders. She looked over at Brian and gave him an incredibly subtle, victorious nod. They genuinely believed I had just consumed a massive lethal dose of stolen heart medication. They believed their flawless plan was currently coursing through my bloodstream. They sat back down at the kitchen island, with relaxed postures, simply waiting for the inevitable medical emergency to begin. They had absolutely no idea that their chosen murder weapon was currently resting securely inside my breast pocket. The poisoned oatmeal was perfectly preserved as undeniable forensic evidence. They thought they had secured their financial future and eliminated their biggest obstacle. Instead, they had just handed me the exact physical key I needed to lock them both inside a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. I finished my cup of coffee in silence, enjoying the quiet morning before I initiated the total destruction of their world. I wiped my mouth with the white linen napkin and pushed my heavy wooden chair away from the dining table. I looked directly at Rachel and announced to the room that I was going outside for my usual morning walk around the property perimeter. Brian did not bother to look up from his cheap plastic burner phone. Rachel simply nodded and told me to wear a heavy coat because the wind was picking up aggressively across the valley. I walked into the mudroom and slipped my arms into my thick wool jacket. I carefully patted the inside breast pocket to ensure the plastic bag containing the poisoned oatmeal was completely secure. I stepped out through the back door and onto the crushed gravel path. The cold morning air filled my lungs and sharpened my senses. I did not walk around the perimeter of the estate. I walked directly to my restored vintage pickup truck parked behind the detached garage. I climbed inside the cold cabin and started the heavy engine. I drove down the long, winding driveway and merged onto the main county highway. My destination was the primary branch of the National Commercial Bank located in the center of town. I needed liquid capital immediately. I needed to hire a specialized team of private investigators to build an airtight surveillance net around my house before my son Michael arrived with his federal agents. The drive took exactly 20 minutes. The rural landscape flashed by my windows in a blur of green pine trees and gray stone walls. I kept my breathing slow and measured. I pulled into the freshly paved parking lot of the bank and parked my truck in the back corner. I walked through the heavy glass double doors and entered the main lobby. The environment was quiet and deeply familiar to me. I had conducted my personal and corporate business at this specific branch for nearly 3 decades. The smell of polished floor wax and fresh coffee permeated the air. I walked across the wide marble floor and approached the teller window at the far end of the long mahogany counter. A young teller named Susan smiled brightly and asked how she could assist me this morning. I handed her my primary state identification card and my platinum debit card. I calmly requested a certified cashier check for $50,000 drawn directly from my main liquid savings account. Susan typed my personal account number into her computer terminal with practiced ease. I watched her green eyes scan the digital monitor. Her warm, professional smile instantly vanished. A look of deep confusion and sudden anxiety washed over her face. She cleared the screen and typed the sequence of numbers a second time. She nervously bit her bottom lip and looked at me with a profound sense of awkwardness. She leaned forward and lowered her voice to a highly concerned whisper. She informed me that she could not process the withdrawal transaction. She stated that the computer system showed my entire financial portfolio was locked under a severe administrative freeze. I stood perfectly still. I asked her to clarify the exact legal nature of the freeze. Susan looked around the empty lobby nervously before turning her monitor slightly toward me. She explained that a certified medical directive had been uploaded into the National Banking Registry exactly 45 minutes ago. The legal document officially declared me completely incapacitated and entirely unfit to manage my own financial affairs. The digital system showed that my son-in-law Brian was now the sole legal conservator of my entire estate. The sheer brazenness of their actions hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Brian had not even waited for the poisoned oatmeal to take effect. He had not waited for me to collapse on the kitchen floor in agony. He was so incredibly desperate to access my wealth that he preemptively filed the forged medical power of attorney the moment I stepped out of the house. The conflict was accelerating much faster than I had originally anticipated. If Brian was moving this quickly, it meant the cartel was applying massive physical pressure on him to finalize the property transfer today. My money was completely trapped behind a wall of fraudulent legal paperwork. A lesser man would have caused a massive scene right there in the lobby. A lesser man would have screamed at the teller and demanded his money violently. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I knew Susan was simply a low-level employee strictly following corporate protocol. I calmly asked Susan to leave her station and bring the branch manager to the front counter. I specifically asked for Paul. Susan hesitated and stated that Paul was currently in a highly important executive meeting. I looked directly into her eyes and told her to interrupt the meeting immediately. I told her to inform Paul that the man who saved his life in 2009 was standing in the lobby waiting for him. Susan swallowed hard and quickly walked away from the counter. I stood alone in the quiet lobby for exactly 3 minutes. The heavy wooden door to the executive offices suddenly swung open with great force. Paul hurried across the marble floor. He was a tall man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit. He looked deeply concerned and slightly out of breath. 15 years ago, Paul was the prime target of a devastating and entirely unjust audit by the Internal Revenue Service. A malicious former business partner had framed Paul for massive corporate tax evasion. Paul was facing total financial ruin along with the loss of his family home and a guaranteed federal prison sentence. He was severely depressed and entirely devoid of hope. I was the private forensic accountant who spent 4 agonizing months tearing apart the fraudulent corporate ledgers. I painstakingly followed the digital breadcrumbs until I found the hidden offshore routing numbers. Those numbers proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his partner was the actual thief. I handed Paul his life back on a silver platter. He had sworn a blood oath of absolute loyalty to me the day the federal charges against him were officially dropped. Paul grasped my hand firmly and led me away from the teller counter without saying a word. He guided me into his private corner office and locked the heavy oak door behind us. He immediately closed the horizontal window blinds to block out the view from the main lobby. Paul sat down behind his massive mahogany desk and asked me what was happening. He pulled up my personal account profile on his private executive terminal. He stared at the screen and confirmed that a legally binding medical conservatorship had indeed been activated by Brian. He told me his hands were completely tied by strict federal banking regulations. He stated that any attempt to move the frozen funds would trigger an immediate fraud alert and automatically dispatch local law enforcement to the branch. I did not argue with his professional assessment. I simply reached into my heavy wool jacket. I pulled out my smartphone and placed it flat on his desk. I opened the video file I had recorded from the attic the previous night. I pressed play and pushed the device toward him. Paul watched the screen in absolute silence. He watched my daughter and her husband discussing the millions of dollars in illegal cartel cash spread across my dining table. He listened to Rachel explicitly detail her plan to crush the beta blockers into my breakfast, to trigger a massive localized stroke. The color completely drained from the face of Paul. He looked physically sick to his stomach. He covered his mouth with his hand as the video concluded. I then reached into my inside breast pocket. I extracted the thick plastic storage bag containing the warm, sticky remains of the poisoned oatmeal. I placed the bag directly on top of his polished desk right next to the phone. I told Paul that the chosen murder weapon was currently leaking maple syrup onto his mahogany table. Paul stared at the bag of oatmeal and then looked up at me. He realized the terrifying magnitude of the situation immediately. This was not a simple family dispute over a checking account or a misunderstood legal document. This was an active conspiracy to commit murder involving a highly violent international money laundering syndicate. Paul did not cite banking regulations anymore. He did not talk about standard operating procedures or compliance protocols. He understood that my life was in immediate fatal danger. Paul cracked his knuckles loudly and pulled his computer keyboard closer to his chest. He told me that a standard branch manager could not override a court-ordered medical directive under any circumstances. He then looked me dead in the eye and stated that he was not a standard branch manager. He was the senior regional vice president of the entire Eastern Seaboard Division. Paul opened a hidden administrative portal on his secure computer system. He typed in a long and complex sequence of executive authorization codes. He explained that he was creating a ghost account on my behalf. It was a highly secure offshore routing destination, completely disconnected from my social security number and my domestic financial footprint. It was a digital vault utilized exclusively by international corporate clients to protect massive assets during hostile takeovers. The mechanical clacking of his keyboard filled the quiet office. Paul moved with frantic precision. He bypassed the local security freeze by reclassifying my $4 million as a pending international corporate escrow transfer. The banking system did not recognize this action as a personal withdrawal by an incapacitated old man. It recognized it as a highly privileged institutional maneuver executed by a senior executive. Paul linked the new offshore routing number directly to a secure biometric application he quickly installed on my phone. He pressed the final execution key on his keyboard. A small green loading bar appeared on his monitor. We both sat in agonizing silence, watching the digital progress slowly inch across the screen. Every single second felt like an hour. If Brian checked his newly acquired financial control panel right now, he would see the money moving and panic. He might call the cartel prematurely. The green bar finally reached the far end of the screen. A bold confirmation message flashed across the monitor, indicating success. The massive financial transaction was completely finalized. Paul leaned back in his leather executive chair and let out a long, heavy breath. He handed me a small piece of paper containing the encrypted access codes to my new wealth. He told me that my domestic accounts now held a grand total of $0.00. Brian had successfully executed his master plan to steal my identity and control my life. He currently possessed a legally binding document granting him absolute legal power over my financial empire. But that empire was now nothing more than an empty shell. He had kicked down the heavy steel door to the vault, only to find the room completely stripped bare of all valuables. I thanked Paul for his unwavering loyalty and his incredible bravery. I carefully picked up the plastic bag of poisoned oatmeal and placed it back inside my jacket pocket. I picked up my phone and secured it in my trousers. I unlocked the heavy oak door of the executive office and stepped back out into the main lobby. The trap was now fully armed, and Brian was standing blindly on the trigger. I walked out of the bank and into the bright morning sunlight, fully prepared to dismantle the rest of his miserable life. I left the bank parking lot and merged back onto the main highway. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, but the warmth did not reach the cab of my truck. My next destination was located in the historic district of the county seat. I drove past the modern strip malls and the new housing developments until the architecture shifted to red brick and white columns. I parked my truck in front of a restored Victorian building. A discreet brass plaque next to the heavy mahogany door read the name of my longtime attorney. Stephen and I had known each other for over 30 years. He was a brilliant legal mind who specialized in ironclad estate planning and aggressive corporate litigation. We had played golf together. Our late wives had organized charity dinners together. He was not just my legal counsel. He was one of the few men on this earth I trusted completely. I walked into the quiet reception area. The firm smelled of old paper and lemon furniture polish. The receptionist recognized me immediately and offered a warm greeting. I did not return her smile. I asked her to tell Stephen that I needed to see him immediately regarding a matter of life and death. The receptionist saw the cold seriousness in my eyes and quickly picked up her telephone. Less than a minute later, the heavy wooden door to the inner offices opened. Stephen stepped out wearing his usual tailored gray suit. He took one look at my face and ushered me into his private office without a single question. He closed the door and locked it. He motioned for me to sit in one of the leather armchairs opposite his massive oak desk. I did not sit down. I walked directly to his desk and placed my smartphone on the center blotter. I told him to watch the video I had recorded last night. Stephen adjusted his reading glasses and leaned forward. He pressed the play button. The office was dead silent, except for the recorded voices of my daughter and her husband. Stephen watched the screen with intense focus. I watched his face. I saw the initial confusion morph into stark disbelief. I saw the disbelief harden into pure, unadulterated rage. He listened to Brian boast about the forged signatures and the cartel money. He listened to Rachel detail her exact recipe for poisoning my breakfast oatmeal with crushed beta blockers. Stephen pushed the phone away as the video ended. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked up at me and his voice was completely hollow. He asked me how I was standing in his office right now. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the sealed plastic bag containing the maple syrup and the lethal oatmeal. I placed it gently on his desk next to the phone. I explained how I swapped the bowls under the guise of an oil leak distraction. Stephen stared at the bag of poisoned food. The reality of the betrayal hit him just as hard as it had hit me. He had watched Rachel grow up. He had attended her high school graduation. Now he was looking at undeniable physical evidence of her attempt to murder her own father for real estate. Stephen immediately reached for his desk telephone. He stated that we needed to call the county sheriff right now. He wanted to dispatch a squad car to my house to arrest them both for attempted homicide and fraud. I reached across the desk and placed my hand firmly over the receiver. I pressed the plastic button down to disconnect the line. I told Stephen that calling the local police was the absolute worst thing we could do. I explained my reasoning with cold logic. If a local sheriff cruiser pulled into my driveway, Brian and Rachel would see them coming from a mile away. They would have at least 3 minutes to react. 3 minutes was more than enough time to throw the burner phones into the fireplace. It was more than enough time to shred the forged property deeds and flush the remaining beta blockers down the toilet. A local police interrogation would give them the opportunity to deny everything. They would hire expensive defense lawyers with the cartel cash. They would claim the video was taken out of context or digitally altered. I refused to leave any room for reasonable doubt. I refused to let them negotiate a plea deal. I told Stephen that I did not want a messy trial. I wanted absolute financial and legal annihilation. I wanted them caught in the very act of selling fraudulent land to a violent international syndicate. Stephen slowly removed his hand from the telephone. He understood my perspective completely. He was a lawyer who knew that surprise was the most devastating weapon in any legal battle. He nodded his head and asked me what I needed him to do. I told him we had 2 massive problems to solve before the sun went down. The first problem was the fraudulent medical power of attorney. The second problem was the 60-acre property itself. Stephen pulled his keyboard toward him and opened his legal database. He typed my name into the county registry. He confirmed what the bank manager had already told me. Brian had successfully filed a petition declaring me mentally unfit and physically incapacitated. The document was signed by a corrupt physician Brian had likely bribed with his illegal cash advance. Stephen closed the window and his fingers flew across the keyboard. He stated that a fraudulent medical directive was incredibly dangerous, but it was not invincible. It relied entirely on the absence and silence of the victim. I was neither absent nor silent. Stephen drafted an immediate legal countermeasure. It was a sworn affidavit of competency. It was a dense legal document declaring that I was of sound mind and body. It explicitly revoked any and all previous powers of attorney regardless of their origin or date. Stephen printed the document and called his senior paralegal into the office to act as an official witness. He also called a partner from a neighboring law firm to act as a second independent witness. I sat at his oak desk and signed my name in thick black ink. The paralegal stamped the document with her official notary seal. Stephen immediately scanned the notarized affidavit and electronically filed it directly with the state Supreme Court registry. He bypassed the local county clerk entirely to ensure Brian would not receive an automatic notification of the change. The first problem was solved. The fraudulent medical directive was now completely null and void. Brian believed he had total control over my life, but he was operating on dead legal authority. The second problem was far more complex. We needed to deal with the 60-acre estate. I explained to Stephen what my son Michael had told me about the buyers. The Shell Corporation was a front for a violent money laundering syndicate. They did not want my land to build a family home or start a farm. They wanted the land because of its specific location and its commercial zoning status. The property sat directly on top of a major underground aquifer. It was legally zoned for high-density commercial development. The cartel planned to build a massive fake industrial complex on the site to wash hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal drug money through construction contracts and phantom vendor payments. The land was only valuable to them because they could build on it. I told Stephen we needed to make the land completely worthless to a commercial developer overnight. I needed a legal mechanism to destroy the value of the property before the cartel lieutenant arrived tonight to sign the final paperwork. Stephen leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He was calculating decades of property law and zoning regulations in his head. He remained completely silent for 5 full minutes. Then a sharp, predatory smile spread across his face. He sat up and began pulling heavy leather-bound law books from the shelves behind his desk. He slammed them onto the desk and flipped through the thin pages rapidly. He told me about a highly obscure federal environmental loophole. My property bordered a state-protected national forest. Several years ago, a rare species of migratory bird had been spotted nesting near the edge of my woods. Stephen explained that we could execute an emergency transfer of the property deed to a federal conservation trust. By donating the land entirely to the federal government for the express purpose of environmental preservation, we would trigger an immediate and irrevocable change in the zoning status. The land would instantly become federally protected habitat. It could never be cleared. It could never be paved. It could never have a commercial structure built upon it. The zoning change would be absolute and permanent. The multi-million-dollar commercial value of the estate would evaporate into thin air the exact second the transfer was recorded. Stephen looked at me seriously. He warned me that this was a nuclear option. He explained that I could never get the land back. The donation was irreversible. The house I built with my own hands and the woods where I raised my children would belong to the federal government forever. I would be allowed to live out the remainder of my natural life in the primary residence under a special caretaker provision, but I would never truly own it again. I would not be able to sell it or pass it down. I looked around the quiet law office. I thought about my daughter standing in my kitchen with a bright smile while she served me poison. I thought about the greedy smirk on Brian as he counted cartel money on my dining table. The land was already gone. They had already stolen the emotional value of the home the moment they decided my life was worth less than a payout. I told Stephen that I did not care about the dirt or the bricks anymore. I only cared about the trap. I gave him the absolute authorization to proceed with the transfer. Stephen drafted the massive federal donation contract. He worked with a speed and precision that was incredible to witness. He contacted a federal judge he knew personally to expedite the environmental review process. He utilized every favor and every connection he had built over his 40-year career. He sent the documents through secure federal channels. We sat in his office for 3 agonizing hours, waiting for the confirmation. We drank bitter black coffee and went over the timeline for the evening. We discussed exactly how the trap would spring. Finally, the secure fax machine in the corner of the office began to whir and click. A single piece of heavy bonded paper slid out of the machine. Stephen walked over and picked it up. He read the text carefully and then handed it to me. It was an official certificate from the United States Department of the Interior. It bore a large golden seal and a federal tracking number. It confirmed that the 60-acre property was now officially and permanently recognized as a protected federal wildlife sanctuary. The commercial zoning status was officially revoked. I held the piece of paper in my hands. It felt incredibly light, but it carried the destructive weight of a bomb. Brian had promised the cartel a prime piece of commercial real estate. He had taken their $500,000 cash advance based on that specific promise. When the cartel lieutenant arrived tonight to finalize the deal, Brian would be trying to sell him land that he did not own. He would be trying to sell federal property to a violent criminal organization. The cartel would immediately realize they had been completely defrauded. The money laundering operation would be ruined. Their rage would be directed entirely at Brian and Rachel. Stephen took the certificate from my hands and placed it inside a thick leather portfolio. He handed the portfolio to me. He told me that my armor was now complete. My money was safely hidden in an offshore account. My medical autonomy was legally restored. My property was completely untouchable. I was a ghost holding all the strings. I thanked Stephen for his brilliant work. I shook his hand firmly and walked out of the law office. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. The final confrontation was only hours away. I climbed back into my truck and drove toward the secure location where I was scheduled to meet my son Michael. It was time to coordinate the exact timing of the federal raid. I left the historic district and steered my truck toward the dense urban center of the city. The afternoon traffic was thick and sluggish. I navigated through the labyrinth of concrete and steel until I reached the address Michael had provided. It was a massive subterranean parking structure beneath a federal courthouse. The entrance was heavily guarded by armed security personnel, but my license plate had already been cleared by federal authorities. The heavy iron gate rolled open, and I descended into the subterranean darkness. The air down here was cold and smelled of damp concrete and heavy exhaust fumes. I drove down the concrete ramps to the lowest level exactly as Michael had instructed. Level 4 was completely abandoned. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty parking spaces. I parked my truck in a dark corner facing the thick concrete wall. I turned off the engine and sat in the heavy silence waiting for my son. A pair of bright headlights suddenly swept across the concrete pillars. A black, unmarked sport utility vehicle pulled into the space directly next to my truck. The heavy engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man stepped out into the dim light. It was my oldest son, Michael. He wore a dark suit and a tactical earpiece. His face was drawn and exhausted. He carried the heavy professional burden of his badge and the agonizing personal reality of his sister betraying our family. I stepped out of my truck, and we embraced. It was not a warm family greeting. It was the tight, desperate grip of two men standing on the edge of a massive battlefield. He quickly scanned the perimeter of the dark garage before gesturing for me to get inside the back of his vehicle. I climbed into the rear seat. The interior of the vehicle was heavily armored and filled with complex federal communication equipment. Michael locked the heavy doors and turned on a white noise generator to block any potential listening devices. He looked at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold and completely professional. He asked me if I had successfully secured my assets. I told him about the hidden offshore bank transfer and the permanent federal conservation trust. I told him that Brian and Rachel were currently holding a worthless hand of cards and operating on dead legal authority. Michael let out a heavy sigh of relief, but his face remained intensely serious. He told me that securing the financial assets was only the first step. He stated that the physical situation was far more dangerous than I could possibly imagine. He pulled a thick, classified dossier from the passenger seat and tossed it into my lap. He told me to open the file and look at the faces of the people my daughter had invited into my home. I opened the heavy folder. The first page contained a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs. I recognized the man in the pictures immediately. It was the county property appraiser who had toured my estate with Brian earlier that day. Michael pointed at the photograph. He explained that the man was not a local government employee. His real name was Hector. He was a high-ranking lieutenant for one of the most violent international drug cartels currently operating in North America. Michael explained the full operational scope of the criminal conspiracy. The cartel generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal street cash every single month. They desperately needed legitimate commercial real estate to launder that massive amount of money into the legal domestic banking system. My pristine 60-acre property was the absolute perfect target. It possessed the exact commercial zoning requirements they needed. They planned to build a massive fake industrial complex on my land to wash dirty money through fraudulent construction contracts and phantom vendor payments. I looked up from the terrifying photographs and asked Michael how a pathetic coward like Brian ever got involved with an international crime syndicate. Michael turned in his seat and looked directly at me. He explained that Brian had a catastrophic gambling addiction that he had kept hidden for years. He had lost millions of dollars betting on illegal offshore sports books controlled directly by the cartel. Brian was completely bankrupt and facing total ruin. The cartel had given Brian a terrifying ultimatum last month. He either paid his massive debts in full or they would murder him and his entire family. Brian panicked like a cornered rat. He offered them the only valuable asset he had access to. He offered them my land. He promised them a prime commercial development site in exchange for wiping his massive gambling debts clean and a $500,000 cash advance to maintain his wealthy facade. My stomach turned into a hard knot of pure ice. I asked Michael the one question that was actively tearing my soul apart. I asked him how much Rachel knew about the cartel and the money laundering operation. Michael looked down at his hands. He spoke in a quiet, heavy voice. He told me the federal wiretaps confirmed that Rachel knew absolutely everything. She knew about the massive gambling debts. She knew about the violent nature of the anonymous buyers. She willingly agreed to poison her own father to secure the property transfer and save her husband. She chose to sacrifice my life and steal my legacy to maintain her comfortable suburban lifestyle. Hearing the absolute confirmation of her evil from my own son solidified my resolve completely. Any lingering fragment of paternal mercy I held for my daughter instantly evaporated in the cold air of that armored vehicle. I was no longer a father dealing with a rebellious child. I was a man dealing with a lethal threat. Michael leaned over the center console. He told me the operation was now completely under federal jurisdiction. He stated that the cartel would send Hector to my house tomorrow evening to sign the final transfer deeds and finalize the money laundering operation. Michael told me that I had done enough. He wanted to pull me out of the danger zone immediately. He offered to transport me to a highly secure federal safe house in a completely different state. He promised to send a heavily armed tactical team to raid my property tomorrow night and arrest everyone involved. He begged me to walk away and let the federal authorities handle the physical confrontation. He reminded me that Hector would undoubtedly be armed and extremely dangerous. He warned me that one wrong move could result in a massive and deadly shootout in my dining room. I closed the classified dossier and handed it back to Michael. I looked my son directly in the eye and gave him my final unyielding answer. I absolutely refused to leave. I explained my tactical reasoning with cold and deliberate logic. If I suddenly disappeared from the house, Brian and Rachel would instantly know something was wrong. They would panic and warn the cartel. The buyers would scatter back across the border, and the federal government would lose their only opportunity to dismantle the entire money laundering network. More importantly, I had a deeply personal reason to stay. I told Michael that Rachel had invited a violent monster into my home to steal my life. I refused to run away and hide like a frightened animal. I needed to be sitting at the head of my own dining table when the trap finally closed. I needed to look my daughter directly in the eyes when she realized she had lost absolutely everything she valued. Michael stared at me for a long time. He saw the immovable resolve in my posture and the cold calculation in my eyes. He knew he could not force me to leave without compromising the entire federal investigation. He finally nodded his head in reluctant agreement. He pulled out a detailed topographical map of my rural estate and spread it across the center console. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously coordinating the joint strike for the following evening. Michael explained that he would deploy a heavily armed hostage rescue team into the dense woods surrounding my property hours before the cartel arrived. They would wear camouflage and utilize advanced thermal imaging cameras to monitor every single movement inside the house. They would have federal snipers positioned in the tree line with clear lines of sight directly into the dining room windows. We needed a specific physical trigger to initiate the raid safely. I told Michael about the federal conservation certificate I possessed in my jacket pocket. I explained my plan to present the certificate at the exact moment Hector demanded my signature on the forged deeds. Michael agreed the plan was brilliant, but incredibly dangerous. He warned me that Hector would instantly realize the land was worthless and the deal was a federal trap. The cartel lieutenant would likely react with immediate lethal violence toward Brian. Michael instructed me to drop to the floor the exact second I revealed the certificate. That sudden physical action would be the visual cue for the federal agents to breach the doors and windows simultaneously. We synchronized our watches down to the exact second. The signing was scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. I would spend the next 24 hours living inside a house with 2 people who actively wanted me dead. I had to maintain this perfect illusion of a weak and compliant old man whose brain was slowly failing. I had to smile at my daughter while knowing she was actively planning my funeral. I shook hands with Michael one last time. He promised me he would not let anything happen to me. I stepped out of the armored vehicle and walked back to my vintage truck. The underground garage felt even colder than before. I started the heavy engine and drove up the concrete ramp toward the bright surface. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. The financial snare was set, and the federal net was waiting. I just had to survive one more night to watch the trap spring shut and deliver absolute ruin to my enemies. The sun began to dip behind the thick line of evergreen trees bordering my property as I steered my vintage truck back onto my long gravel driveway. The transition from daylight to creeping shadows perfectly mirrored the dark reality I was driving back into. I was no longer returning to a sanctuary of peace and retirement. I was willingly stepping back into a designated kill zone occupied by 2 people who wanted me dead. I needed to convince my daughter and her parasitic husband that their lethal poison was actively working. I had to perform the most important acting role of my entire life. I gripped the cold leather steering wheel tightly and forced my racing heart to slow down to a calm and rhythmic pace. I approached the detached garage and pressed my foot against the brake pedal. I did not park the truck in my usual precise manner. I intentionally turned the steering wheel sharply at the last second and left the vehicle parked at a highly awkward angle. I left the front left tire resting heavily on the manicured grass of the front lawn. It was a highly visible and deliberate sign of cognitive decline. I turned off the heavy engine and stepped out into the cold evening air. I walked slowly toward the back wooden deck of the main house. I pulled my heavy brass keyring from the pocket of my wool coat. I forced my hands to tremble violently. I stood on the wooden porch and fumbled blindly with the deadbolt. I intentionally loosened my grip and let the heavy ring of keys slip through my trembling fingers. The brass keys hit the wooden deck with a loud metallic clatter. I did not bend down to pick them up. I stood there staring blankly at the solid oak door, with my shoulders slumped forward. I heard heavy footsteps approaching from the inside of the house. The door swung open to reveal Rachel. She wore a look of mild irritation that quickly transformed into a state of intense predatory curiosity when she observed my confused posture. I looked at my daughter with wide, vacant eyes. I muttered in a slightly slurred voice that my hands felt strangely numb and that I had dropped my keys. Rachel looked down at the wooden deck and smiled a thin smile that was entirely devoid of any human warmth. She bent down and retrieved the keys for me. She placed a condescending hand on my shoulder and guided me inside the mudroom as if I were a lost and heavily medicated child. I dragged my feet slightly across the slate tiles. I allowed my entire body to project immense physical weakness. We walked slowly into the main living room. Brian was lounging comfortably on my expensive leather sofa, with his feet propped up on the mahogany coffee table I had purchased in Europe. He was watching a loud sporting event on the large television screen. I stood in the exact center of the room and looked around wildly, as if I did not recognize my own furniture. I turned my head slowly toward Rachel. I asked her in a quiet and confused tone what time her mother was coming home from the grocery store. My beautiful wife had passed away from cancer 7 years ago. Rachel stopped walking and simply stared at me. A look of profound and sickening triumph washed over her face. She looked past me and gave Brian a highly significant nod. Brian instantly muted the television. He sat up straight and watched me with the intense, unblinking focus of a starving predator observing a wounded animal in the forest. Rachel answered me in a sickeningly sweet and highly exaggerated voice. She gently patted my arm and reminded me that Mom had been gone for a very long time. I forced a look of deep sorrow and sudden panic onto my face. I rubbed my temples aggressively and nodded my head in slow submission. I shuffled my feet across the carpet and walked toward my favorite leather reading chair. I sat down heavily and stared blankly at the dark television screen. I waited exactly 4 minutes in total silence. Then I slowly turned my head back toward Rachel. I asked her for the second time what time her mother was returning with the groceries. Brian actually laughed out loud. It was a short, cruel bark of amusement that echoed through the quiet room. He stood up from the sofa and walked confidently into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of expensive bourbon from my private liquor cabinet. Rachel did not even bother to correct my memory the second time. She simply walked over and patted the top of my head like I was an obedient dog. She told me to just rest my tired brain and that dinner would be ready very soon. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the soft leather chair. I regulated my breathing to mimic a light state of sleep. I waited another 5 agonizing minutes. I opened my eyes slowly and looked directly at the kitchen doorway where Rachel was currently standing. I asked her for the third time when my wife would be home. Rachel turned away from me and looked directly at Brian, who was leaning against the granite kitchen counter. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated victory. Their false confidence was absolutely sickening to witness. They genuinely believed the crushed beta blockers they thought I ingested during breakfast were currently ravaging the neural pathways inside my brain. They firmly believed the stolen medication was triggering a cascading series of silent microstrokes that were systematically wiping away my memory and my basic cognitive functions. They thought I was rapidly descending into a permanent state of severe dementia. They believed their master plan to destroy my mind and steal my wealth was executing flawlessly. Rachel announced that dinner was ready and guided me to the dining room table. She placed a plate of roasted chicken and vegetables in front of me. I knew I needed to escalate the physical performance to fully cement their false sense of security. I picked up my silver fork with a violently shaking hand. I attempted to pierce a piece of chicken, but I intentionally missed the meat entirely. The silver fork scraped loudly against the ceramic plate. I then reached for my tall glass of ice water. I fumbled my grip and knocked the heavy glass completely over. The cold water spilled across the polished mahogany table and soaked into my linen napkin. Brian let out a loud groan of annoyance, but he was smiling behind his glass of bourbon. Rachel quickly grabbed a towel to wipe up the spill. She told Brian not to be angry because the poor old man simply could not control his failing body anymore. I apologized profusely in a weak and trembling voice. I lowered my head and stared at my lap in mock shame. I abandoned the silverware entirely and simply picked at a piece of bread with my fingers. I allowed them to completely dominate the physical space and dictate the energy of the room. They felt incredibly powerful and entirely untouchable. Brian finished his drink and set his glass down on the table. He reached into the pocket of his designer trousers and pulled out one of the cheap plastic burner phones I had seen him unpack the previous night. He announced to Rachel that he needed to make a quick business call. He stood up and walked out of the dining room. He moved toward the large sliding glass doors leading to the back patio. He stepped outside into the freezing night air and pulled the heavy glass door shut behind him. However, he did not close it completely. He carelessly left a tiny gap, just wide enough for me to hear his voice. He assumed I was too confused and mentally broken to understand a single word of his conversation. I remained perfectly still in my chair, staring blankly at my ruined dinner plate. I focused absolutely all of my attention on the sound of his voice drifting through the narrow opening in the glass door. Brian spoke in a low, rushed whisper. He told the person on the other end of the secure line that everything was completely handled on their end of the transaction. He explicitly used the name Hector. He laughed a highly nervous and deeply arrogant laugh. He stated clearly that the old man was totally gone and completely out of his mind. He proudly told the cartel lieutenant that the special medication worked perfectly and that my brain was officially melting into mush. Brian promised the violent criminal on the phone that I would not put up any resistance during the legal signing tomorrow evening. He guaranteed Hector that I was currently confused enough to sign absolutely any document put in front of me without asking a single question. He quickly confirmed the exact meeting time for the following evening. He then aggressively demanded absolute reassurance from Hector that his massive gambling debts would be immediately erased the exact moment the ink dried on the fraudulent property deeds. The cartel lieutenant apparently gave him the confirmation he desperately needed. Brian thanked him profusely and quickly ended the call. He slid the plastic burner phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath of the freezing air and puffed out his chest. He stood on my back patio looking out over my expansive property as if he already owned every single tree and every blade of grass. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone in the world. He believed he had permanently defeated his catastrophic financial problems and secured a luxurious future by sacrificing the life of his father-in-law. He walked back inside the warm house and rubbed his hands together with greedy anticipation. He looked directly at Rachel and proudly announced that they were going to be incredibly rich by tomorrow night. Rachel smiled brightly and walked across the room to kiss him passionately. I sat alone at the head of the dining table and watched my own daughter celebrate my impending death with the man who was actively selling my home to a criminal syndicate. I felt absolutely no sorrow or regret. My heart was as cold and hard as the stone tiles in the kitchen. I closed my eyes and continued to play the pathetic part of the fading old man. I willingly allowed them to revel in their disgusting and false victory. I knew their extreme arrogance was their ultimate weakness. They were so utterly blinded by their own greed and their perceived cleverness that they could not see the massive federal snare tightening directly around their necks. I just needed to maintain this painful charade for one more day. I needed to let them walk right up to the absolute edge of the cliff before I pushed them both into the abyss. The following morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds pressing down on the valley. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with unspoken anxiety and greedy anticipation. Rachel prepared breakfast with jerky and nervous movements. Brian paced the length of the living room while constantly checking the screen of his cheap plastic burner phone. I sat in my leather armchair near the window playing the role of a heavily medicated ghost. I stared blankly at the television screen while secretly tracking every single sound and movement in the room. I knew the cartel representative was scheduled to arrive before noon to inspect the grounds. They needed to verify the commercial viability of the land before handing over the final transfer documents tonight. A heavy black sport utility vehicle with deeply tinted windows rolled slowly up the gravel driveway at exactly 11 in the morning. The vehicle did not have any county or municipal markings. It came to a smooth halt near the detached garage. Brian practically sprinted out the front door to greet the arrival. I remained perfectly still in my chair, but I shifted my eyes toward the window. A large man stepped out of the driver's seat. He was dressed in a beige canvas jacket and held a standard aluminum clipboard. He wore a yellow reflective safety vest over his broad shoulders to complete the illusion of a local government employee. But his physical demeanor completely betrayed his costume. He did not move with the bored and casual posture of a county property appraiser. He moved with the rigid and hyper-vigilant efficiency of a trained killer. He scanned the roofline of my house and the surrounding tree line before he even looked at Brian. Brian rushed forward and extended his hand in a desperate and submissive greeting. The large man did not shake his hand. He simply stared at Brian with cold, dead eyes and pointed toward the dense woods marking the western boundary of my property. Brian swallowed hard and nodded frantically. They began walking side by side down the crushed gravel path toward the old hiking trails. Rachel stood by the front door, watching them leave with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She turned around and looked at me. I intentionally let my mouth hang slightly open and allowed a thin line of saliva to pool at the corner of my lips. Rachel sneered in absolute disgust. She muttered under her breath that I was completely pathetic and walked into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. She assumed I was entirely incapable of leaving my chair. That assumption gave me the exact window of opportunity I needed. I wiped my mouth and stood up silently. I moved with a sudden and fluid grace that completely contradicted the frail performance I had just delivered. I bypassed the creaking floorboards in the hallway and slipped into the first-floor study. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak filing cabinet. I bypassed the old tax returns and pulled out a heavy black canvas bag. I unzipped the bag and extracted a professional-grade digital camera fitted with a massive telephoto lens. During my active years as a forensic accountant, I frequently had to document illegal asset hoarding by corrupt corporate executives. I had spent countless hours sitting in unmarked cars, photographing luxury yachts and hidden mansions. My hands remembered the cold weight of the camera instantly. I checked the battery level and removed the lens cap. I slipped out the side door of the study and stepped quietly onto the damp grass of the side yard. I moved into the thick cover of the evergreen trees. The damp pine needles muffled my footsteps completely. I utilized my intimate knowledge of the 60-acre estate to navigate unseen. I knew exactly where the old hunting trails intersected with the main property lines. I moved quickly through the shadows of the forest canopy, while keeping my breathing steady and controlled. I heard the snapping of dry twigs about 50 yards ahead of me. I crouched down behind a massive fallen oak tree and rested the heavy barrel of the telephoto lens against the rotting bark. I looked through the digital viewfinder and adjusted the focus ring. The sharp image of Brian and the cartel enforcer snapped into perfect clarity. They were standing near the edge of the large natural depression where the underground aquifer was located. The cartel lieutenant was aggressively pointing at the ground and asking sharp questions. I could not hear their voices over the wind, but the body language was incredibly loud and entirely terrifying. Brian was sweating profusely, despite the cold morning air. He was rubbing his neck and nodding constantly. He looked like a terrified hostage trying to appease a violent captor. I adjusted the camera angle and zoomed in directly on the face of the cartel representative. I snapped 5 rapid high-resolution photographs of his profile and his front features. I then lowered the lens slightly and focused on the man's waistline. The wind briefly blew his beige canvas jacket open. The telephoto lens captured the distinct black metallic grip of a heavy-caliber semi-automatic pistol tucked securely into a tactical waistband holster. This man was not a white-collar financial middleman. He was a heavily armed executioner sent to ensure the transaction proceeded without a single complication. I lowered the camera and waited for them to move deeper into the woods before I slowly backed away from the fallen oak tree. I retraced my steps through the dense pines with extreme caution. I slipped back into the house through the side door and locked it silently behind me. Rachel was still in the kitchen, talking on her phone. I walked swiftly back to my leather armchair and tucked the heavy camera underneath a thick wool blanket resting on the floor. I pulled my secure smartphone from my pocket and opened the encrypted messaging application my son Michael had installed the previous night. I quickly attached the high-resolution photographs of the cartel enforcer and the concealed weapon. I typed a brief message confirming that the target was currently on the property conducting the final physical inspection with Brian. I hit send and waited. The response from Michael was almost instantaneous. My secure phone vibrated heavily against my palm. I answered the call and pressed the receiver tightly against my ear. Michael did not use a standard greeting. His voice was incredibly tight and laced with pure adrenaline. He told me that his federal identification software had just confirmed the identity of the man in the photographs. His name was Hector Alvarez. He was not a standard lieutenant. He was the primary enforcer for the entire northern regional operation of the cartel. Michael explained that Hector was personally responsible for at least a dozen unsolved homicides involving rival gang members and federal informants. He was a ruthless sociopath who exclusively handled Tier 1 acquisitions for the syndicate bosses. The danger level in my dining room had just escalated exponentially. Michael explained the terrifying reality of the situation with absolute clarity. The cartel was not treating this property purchase as a routine business transaction. They viewed my 60-acre estate as the absolute crown jewel of their new money-laundering empire. They had sent their most violent killer to close the deal because they could not afford a single mistake. Michael warned me that if Hector sensed any form of legal deception tonight, he would not attempt to renegotiate the terms. He would not threaten to sue Brian for breach of contract. He would simply draw his weapon and execute every single living person in the room to eliminate all witnesses before burning the house to the ground. Michael told me the margin for error was now officially 0. He informed me that the federal hostage rescue team was currently moving into their concealed positions in the woods surrounding my house. He had authorized the deployment of 3 highly trained federal snipers. They were currently dialing in their thermal scopes on my dining room windows. But Michael reiterated the massive vulnerability of our plan. The snipers could not fire until Hector presented a clear and immediate lethal threat. We needed the federal raid to happen the exact millisecond the fraudulent ink hit the paper. We needed Hector to completely drop his guard and focus entirely on the forged documents on the table. I told Michael that I understood the stakes perfectly. I promised him I would maintain the illusion of absolute mental incompetence until the very last second. I instructed him to watch for my physical signal. The moment I placed the federal conservation certificate on the table and dropped to the floor, his tactical teams needed to shatter the glass and breach the doors simultaneously. I told him I loved him and disconnected the secure line. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked around my quiet living room. The antique clock on the mantel ticked softly. The dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the window. It looked like a peaceful home, but it was rapidly transforming into a federal war zone. I heard the front door open and the heavy footsteps of Brian entering the mudroom. I immediately slumped forward in my chair and stared blankly at my hands. Brian walked into the living room and let out a massive sigh of relief. Rachel hurried out of the kitchen and asked him how the inspection went. Brian smiled brightly and clapped his hands together. He proudly announced that Hector loved the property and that the aquifer was perfectly suited for their industrial needs. He confidently stated that the cartel enforcer would return exactly at 8:00 tonight with the final transfer deeds and the remaining cash payment. He looked over at me sitting motionless in the chair. He laughed cruelly and told Rachel that the old man was completely out of it and would not be a problem. They celebrated their impending victory while standing 3 feet away from the man who had just orchestrated their total destruction. I closed my eyes and allowed them to enjoy their final hours of false security. I needed to prepare my mind and my body for the explosive violence that was destined to arrive with the setting sun. The evening shadows finally swallowed the last remaining light in the valley. The digital clock on the kitchen oven displayed 7:30. The atmosphere inside my home was a grotesque theater of premature celebration. Rachel was moving around the kitchen with a frantic and joyful energy. She had spent the last 3 hours preparing a lavish dinner of roasted lamb and expensive root vegetables. The rich smell of rosemary and roasted garlic filled the air. She wore a stunning black evening dress and a pearl necklace that previously belonged to my late wife. She was literally dressing up for the occasion of my financial execution. Brian was standing near the dining room table, carefully opening a bottle of vintage red wine. He had purchased the expensive bottle using the illegal cartel cash advance he received the previous night. He poured the dark crimson liquid into 3 crystal goblets. He did not pour a glass for me. He walked over to the stereo system and turned on a soft, classical symphony. They were creating the perfect aristocratic ambiance to mask their absolute treason. I sat in my usual leather chair in the living room, playing my part flawlessly. I let my head rest heavily against my chest and kept my eyes half closed. I breathed with a slow, raspy rhythm to simulate physical exhaustion. I knew that less than 200 yards away, heavily armed federal agents were currently lying flat in the freezing mud. I knew federal snipers were looking through thermal scopes and actively scanning the glass panes of my dining room windows. The extreme contrast between the warm, elegant dinner party inside the house and the cold, lethal reality waiting outside in the woods was absolutely surreal. I had to tightly control every single muscle in my body to prevent myself from trembling with adrenaline. The trap was fully set, and the final bait was waiting on the table. Brian walked over to the large bay window and peered out into the darkness. He checked his heavy gold watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. His confident facade was beginning to crack under the massive weight of his impending transaction. Dealing with violent international criminals always carries a heavy psychological toll, even for a raging narcissist. Rachel walked out of the kitchen carrying a large silver serving platter. She set the roasted lamb in the exact center of the mahogany dining table. She looked over at me and frowned in deep disgust. She walked across the room and roughly grabbed my arm to pull me up from the chair. She dragged me toward the dining table and pushed me aggressively into my seat at the head of the table. She tied a large white linen napkin around my neck like a bib. She treated me with less dignity than a stray animal. I offered absolutely no physical resistance. I slumped my shoulders forward and stared blankly at the empty porcelain plate in front of me. At exactly 7:55, a pair of bright headlights swept across the front lawn. The heavy crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of the cartel lieutenant. Brian instantly froze in his tracks. He wiped his sweaty palms on his tailored trousers and swallowed hard. He looked at Rachel and nodded sharply. Rachel quickly checked her reflection in the hallway mirror and smoothed the fabric of her expensive dress. The heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed twice. The sound echoed through the quiet house like the pounding of a judge striking a wooden gavel. Brian hurried to the foyer and quickly unlocked the heavy oak door. He pulled it open and offered an overly enthusiastic and desperate greeting. The man who stepped into my hallway was no longer pretending to be a county property appraiser. Hector wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and no tie. The expensive clothing was clearly designed to project the polished image of a sophisticated private wealth manager. But no amount of Italian wool could hide the sheer predatory violence radiating from his physical frame. His eyes were entirely black and devoid of any human empathy. He did not smile at Brian. He did not offer to shake his hand. He simply stepped past my son-in-law and walked directly into the formal dining room. He carried a thick black leather briefcase in his left hand. I immediately noticed the slight unnatural bulge under the left side of his suit jacket. He was still carrying the heavy-caliber handgun I had photographed earlier in the woods. Hector stopped at the edge of the dining table and looked down at me. I maintained my blank, empty stare and allowed my jaw to hang completely slack. I let a small amount of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth to complete the illusion of a stroke victim. Hector watched me for 10 agonizing seconds. He was a professional killer actively assessing a potential physical threat. He was searching for any sign of hidden intelligence or physical resistance in my posture. I gave him absolutely nothing. I projected a state of total cognitive emptiness. Hector finally turned away from me with a look of supreme indifference. He looked at the roasted lamb and the crystal wine glasses resting on the table. He told Brian in a low, gravelly voice that he did not drive all the way out here to eat a family dinner. He stated that he came to finalize the pension transfer and secure the property deeds. He demanded that they conclude the business immediately so he could leave the premises. Brian nervously agreed and rushed forward to pull out a heavy wooden chair for the cartel enforcer. Hector sat down directly across the table from me. He placed the heavy black leather briefcase on top of the polished mahogany wood right next to the silver serving platter. He popped the brass latches with a loud metallic click. He reached inside this dark interior and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. These were the fraudulent transfer deeds that would completely sign away my pristine 60-acre estate to the anonymous cartel shell corporation. Hector placed the documents squarely in front of me on top of my empty porcelain dinner plate. The papers were heavily covered in complex legal jargon, intentionally designed to look like a standard corporate retirement restructuring plan. Brian walked over and stood right next to my chair. He leaned down and spoke to me in a loud, slow voice as if I were completely deaf and entirely stupid. He pointed a shaking finger at the documents. He falsely explained that these were the final pension papers from my old accounting firm. He lied smoothly and told me that signing these specific forms would guarantee my private medical care for the rest of my natural life. He promised me that everything was going to be perfectly fine as long as I put my name on the bottom line. Rachel walked up to the left side of my chair. She reached into the pocket of her black dress and pulled out a heavy gold-plated luxury fountain pen. It was the exact pen I had received as an honorable retirement gift from my senior accounting partners 10 years ago. She uncapped the pen and pressed the cold metal barrel firmly into my right hand. She wrapped her soft fingers tightly around my own to physically force my grip on the pen. She leaned her head in close to my ear. I could smell the expensive floral perfume she wore and the sour metallic scent of her sheer greed. She told me to just sign my name on the paper so we could all finally relax and enjoy our beautiful dinner together. Her eyes were wide and gleaming with an absolute sickening hunger for the millions of dollars sitting inside that leather briefcase. She was staring intensely at the white paper waiting for the black ink to flow. She genuinely believed her ultimate victory was only a few pen strokes away. Brian was holding his breath while watching my hand. Hector sat across the table with his dark eyes locked onto my face. They were completely focused on the illusion they had built. They had absolutely no idea that my son Michael and his federal tactical team were waiting for my next physical move. They did not know that the pen in my hand was not going to sign away my legacy. It was the exact instrument I was about to use to trigger the complete and total destruction of their entire world. The weight of the luxury gold fountain pen felt incredibly heavy in my right hand. Rachel kept her soft fingers wrapped tightly around my knuckles. She was physically attempting to guide the sharp metal nib of the pen toward the bottom right corner of the thick legal document. I could feel the rapid and erratic beating of her pulse through her skin. She was vibrating with a sickening mixture of adrenaline and absolute greed. The dining room was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the soft classical symphony playing from the stereo speakers in the corner of the room. Hector sat directly across from me with his dark eyes entirely devoid of emotion. He was simply waiting for the ink to flow so he could take full legal possession of his new money laundering empire. Brian was leaning directly over my left shoulder. He was breathing heavily through his nose. He smelled of expensive designer cologne and sour, nervous sweat. They had perfectly orchestrated this exact moment. They believed they had successfully navigated every single obstacle. They thought they were merely seconds away from an ultimate and highly lucrative victory. I looked down at the forged transfer deed, resting on top of my empty porcelain dinner plate. The legal formatting was highly sophisticated. It was completely dressed up to look like a standard corporate retirement restructuring plan. It contained complex clauses about wealth management and asset reallocation. But beneath the thick layer of financial jargon, it was nothing more than a crude execution order. It was the physical manifestation of my daughter deciding that my life was entirely worthless. She had eagerly traded my safety and my legacy for a stack of illegal cash inside a black leather briefcase. I stared at the blank signature line for a long time. A small, yellow, sticky note shaped like an arrow pointed directly to the empty space. The sheer, meticulous nature of their betrayal was staggering. I allowed the agonizing silence to stretch and pull at the nerves of everyone in the room. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of anticipation. I wanted them to hover directly over the very edge of their perceived victory before I pulled the ground entirely out from under their feet. Rachel squeezed my hand tighter. Her voice lost its fake sweetness and took on a sharp edge of desperate panic. She whispered aggressively in my ear to stop staring blankly at the paper and just write my name. I did not move the pen toward the paper. I focused entirely on the physical sensation of her holding my hand. Her skin was incredibly soft, but her grip was like a steel vise. She was trying to puppet my fingers like I was a broken wooden toy. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second to center my focus. I slowly rotated my wrist counterclockwise. I applied a steady and undeniable physical pressure against her thumb. I forced her fingers to uncurl from my knuckles. I slid my hand completely out of her tight grasp. Rachel gasped softly in genuine surprise and took a small step back. I placed the gold fountain pen down on the polished mahogany table with a highly deliberate metallic click. The sharp sound echoed through the silent dining room like the cocking of a loaded gun. I slowly raised my head. I stopped projecting the pathetic illusion of a heavily medicated stroke victim. I planted my feet firmly on the carpet under the table. I engaged the muscles in my lower back and pulled my spine entirely straight. I lifted my chin. I let the false fog completely clear from my eyes. I narrowed my gaze and focused with the sharp, predatory intensity of a man who had spent 40 years destroying fraudulent empires in federal courtrooms. I turned my head and looked directly into the face of my son-in-law. Brian was still leaning over my left shoulder. The arrogant smirk on his face instantly vanished. He saw the sudden and terrifying clarity in my gaze. He saw a man who was entirely in control of his mental faculties. The profound shock hit him so hard, he physically stumbled backward and bumped heavily into the edge of the granite kitchen island. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He was standing so close, I could hear the wet clicking of his saliva as he swallowed. His eyes darted wildly between my face and the cartel enforcer sitting across the table. Brian realized the lethal math of the situation instantly. He had taken $500,000 from a highly violent international syndicate. He had promised them this exact piece of paper. He had guaranteed them an easy transaction with a brain-dead old man. Now the old man was looking at him with eyes full of cold, absolute war. Brian snapped completely under the pressure. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or yell. I spoke with a calm and resonant authority that completely shattered the fragile illusion of their dominance. I clearly stated to the entire room that I could not sell the property. The words hung in the air like a thick cloud of toxic smoke. Hector instantly shifted his weight in his heavy wooden chair. The cartel enforcer dropped his mask of polite boredom and sat forward with extreme predatory aggression. His right hand casually slipped under the left side of his suit jacket, and rested directly on the grip of his concealed weapon. Rachel let out a sharp cry of pure denial. She grabbed the edge of the dining table with both hands. Her face turned incredibly pale as she looked frantically from me to the documents. Brian completely lost his mind. The terrifying reality of the armed cartel lieutenant sitting across the table completely overpowered his logical thought process. He acted out of pure primal terror. He let out a sound that I had never heard a grown man make. It was a high-pitched, nervous laugh that sounded exactly like a dying animal squealing in a trap. He threw his body forward and lunged across the dining room table. He slammed his hip against the edge of the mahogany wood, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently. He grabbed my right wrist with both of his incredibly sweaty hands. He aggressively picked up the gold fountain pen from the table and tried to force it back into my palm. He was babbling a stream of pathetic and incoherent lies. He kept repeating to Hector that I was just confused and that I was having a bad reaction to my new medication. He begged me to just sign the medical papers right now so I could go upstairs and sleep. He was physically trying to drag my hand toward the signature line on the fraudulent deed. His fingernails dug painfully into my skin. He knew that if I did not sign that paper, Hector was going to execute him right there on the dining room rug. I did not pull away immediately. I let him lean all of his weight into his desperate effort. I waited until his center of gravity was completely extended over the table. I let him believe for one final second that he could overpower me with brute force. Then I retaliated. I twisted my wrist violently and broke his desperate grip. I rotated my shoulder and snapped my right arm upward in a tight, violent arc. I struck his wrist with the hardened edge of my palm with a startling and explosive force. The physical impact was incredibly loud. It cracked through the quiet dining room like the breaking of a thick wooden branch. The kinetic force of the blow sent a massive shockwave directly up his arm. Brian screamed in genuine physical agony. He released my arm instantly and stumbled backward, clutching his reddened wrist. The gold fountain pen launched into the air. It tumbled over the silver serving platter and struck the black leather briefcase before clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. Brian looked at me in absolute horror. He finally realized that he was not dealing with a weak and dying old man. He realized he was dealing with an enemy who had completely and utterly outplayed him. I stood up slowly from my chair at the head of the table. I pushed the heavy wooden chair back with the back of my knees. I towered over the forged documents and the spilled wine. I did not speak to Brian. I did not speak to my daughter. I directed my words entirely to the cartel enforcer. I announced to the room that the transaction was completely impossible. I spoke with the icy precision of a judge delivering a final and inescapable verdict. I stated clearly that nobody in this house possessed the legal authority to transfer the property deeds to a commercial buyer. I told them that I had personally visited my private attorney 24 hours ago. I revealed that I had officially donated the entire 60-acre estate to the federal government. I watched the profound realization wash over the face of the cartel enforcer. Hector understood the devastating legal implications immediately. He knew that federal protected conservation land was completely untouchable. He knew the land was entirely worthless for a commercial money laundering operation. His eyes narrowed into dark, violent slits. Brian fell to his knees on the hardwood floor. He was weeping openly and begging me to tell him it was a sick joke. Rachel began to shake violently. She slammed her fists against the mahogany table and demanded that I stop lying. She screamed that I was ruining her life and that my brain was completely ruined by the medication. I ignored her completely. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my thick wool jacket. I felt the crisp edge of the federal certificate. I pulled the document out into the light. I unfolded it with slow and deliberate movements. The large golden seal of the Department of the Interior caught the light of the dining room chandelier. I held the certificate up for Hector to read. I then dropped the official Conservation Trust document directly on top of their forged transfer deed. The heavy bonded paper landed with a soft but devastating thud. It covered the blank signature line completely. The trap was now completely sprung. The bait was snatched away. The only thing left in the room was the lethal consequence of their absolute failure. The heavy bonded paper of the Federal Conservation Certificate rested on the table. The large golden seal of the United States Department of the Interior seemed to glow under the light of the crystal chandelier. Hector stared at the document with absolute stillness. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody in the dining room moved or breathed. The classical symphony continued to play softly from the corner speakers. Hector slowly leaned forward. He read the intricate legal text printed on the certificate. He processed the absolute finality of the words. He understood that the 60 acres of land beneath his feet now belonged exclusively to the federal government. He realized the prime commercial real estate his cartel desperately needed for their massive money laundering operation was permanently gone. The sophisticated facade of the private wealth manager instantly vanished. The tailored suit could no longer hide the ruthless cartel enforcer underneath. The dark eyes of Hector turned entirely black with lethal intent. He slowly lifted his gaze from the federal document and locked his eyes directly onto Brian. The physical transformation of Hector was terrifying to witness. He did not yell or curse. He moved with the cold and practiced efficiency of a man who killed people for a living. He pushed his heavy wooden dining chair back with the back of his legs. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up to his full imposing height. He reached his right hand inside the left lapel of his charcoal suit jacket. He withdrew a heavy-caliber semi-automatic pistol. The weapon was entirely black and fitted with a long cylindrical sound suppressor attached to the barrel. The dull matte finish of the metal absorbed the light in the room. Hector raised the weapon smoothly. He pointed the suppressed barrel directly at the center of the chest of my son-in-law. The silence in the room was completely shattered by the sharp metallic click of Hector disengaging the safety mechanism on the pistol. The lethal threat was no longer implied or hidden. It was actively aimed at the heart of the man who had brought this monster into my home. Hector spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding stones. He did not ask for an explanation about the federal land trust. He did not care about the zoning laws or the legal technicalities. He only cared about the massive amount of stolen cartel money. He coldly informed Brian that he had exactly 10 seconds to produce the $500,000 cash advance. Hector stated that if the heavy canvas duffel bag containing the money was not placed on the dining room table immediately, he would pull the trigger. He promised to shoot Brian in the stomach first to ensure he died slowly and painfully. He then promised to execute Rachel and finally turn the weapon on me. He delivered this horrific death threat with the casual tone of a man ordering a cup of coffee. He was completely serious and entirely capable of murdering everyone in the house without a single trace of hesitation or regret. The sight of the suppressed pistol completely broke the fragile mind of Brian. All of his arrogant posture and his smug superiority evaporated into the cold air. The reality of his catastrophic failure finally crushed him. His knees buckled underneath his weight. He collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor right next to my dining chair. He did not try to defend himself. He did not try to negotiate or apologize to the armed killer standing across the table. He immediately reverted to a state of absolute pathetic cowardice. Tears streamed rapidly down his flushed face. He clasped his sweaty hands together and held them up toward Hector in a desperate gesture of surrender. He sobbed uncontrollably. His chest heaved with violent gasps for air. He begged for his life in a high-pitched and broken voice. He swore he did not know anything about the federal donation. He desperately tried to shift the entire blame onto me. When Hector did not lower the weapon, Brian turned his weeping face toward his wife. Brian grabbed the hem of the black evening dress Rachel was wearing. He tugged at the expensive fabric like a terrified child. He begged Rachel to do something to save him. He pleaded with her to go upstairs and find the canvas duffel bag of cash they had hidden in the guest bedroom. He sobbed that they needed to give the cartel their money back right now before they were all murdered. He completely abandoned any pretense of being a protective husband. He was actively begging his wife to step between him and a loaded firearm. He showed his true nature in the face of absolute danger. He was a weak and parasitic creature who only cared about his own survival. He knelt on the floor in a puddle of spilled wine and his own tears completely destroyed by the consequences of his extreme greed. Rachel did not look down at her sobbing husband. She did not look at the armed cartel enforcer pointing a gun across the table. Her eyes were locked entirely on me. Her reaction was not fear or remorse. Her reaction was pure, unadulterated rage. The sight of the federal conservation certificate had completely short-circuited her mind. She realized that her guaranteed path to immense wealth and luxury had just been permanently burned to the ground. She realized she was not going to inherit $4 million. She realized she was not going to live a life of absolute privilege built on my stolen assets. She ignored the lethal weapon in the room completely. She stepped over her weeping husband and marched directly toward my chair. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure hatred. The beautiful pearls around her neck trembled as she took a deep and furious breath. She leaned over the table and screamed at me with a voice full of venom. She demanded to know how I could possibly ruin her life like this. She shrieked that the property belonged to her by right, and that I had absolutely no authority to give it away to the government. She demanded to know how I had discovered their plan. She yelled about the medical power of attorney and the beta blockers she had crushed into my breakfast. In her blind fury, she openly confessed to her own crimes right in front of the cartel enforcer. She did not care about the legal implications or the physical danger. She only cared about the money she had just lost. She accused me of being a selfish and horrible father who wanted to see his own daughter suffer. She screamed that I was supposed to be dead and out of her way. Her words were a torrent of absolute evil and undeniable proof of her complete moral bankruptcy. I listened to her horrific accusations and felt a profound sense of closure. The last lingering shred of parental doubt vanished completely from my heart. Any normal father would feel an overwhelming desire to protect his child from a loaded weapon. Any normal father would sacrifice himself to save his daughter from an armed cartel enforcer. But Rachel had ceased to be my daughter the moment she mixed poison into my breakfast bowl. She had willingly forfeited her place in my family the moment she measured the value of my life against a stack of illegal cash. I viewed her now with the same cold detachment I reserved for fraudulent corporate executives and corrupt financial thieves. I was merely a forensic accountant watching the final collapse of a totally bankrupt enterprise. The smell of the roasted lamb and the spilled vintage wine mixed with the sharp metallic scent of pure adrenaline in the room. The contrast between the elegant dining setting and the explosive violence unfolding was absolute. I sat in the center of the storm and observed the complete destruction of my family. I did not flinch away from her screaming face. I did not raise my hands to defend myself from her verbal assault. I remained perfectly seated in my heavy wooden chair at the head of the dining table. My posture was incredibly rigid and filled with absolute authority. I did not look at the black barrel of the suppressed pistol Hector was pointing at my family. I did not look at the pathetic weeping man huddled on the floor next to my feet. I looked directly into the hateful eyes of my daughter. I let her scream until her voice began to crack. I let her exhaust all of her toxic energy. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt absolutely no regret. I was sitting inside the exact center of a massive explosion that I had personally engineered. I had forced all of their ugly secrets out into the light. I had stripped away their false power and their unearned wealth. I had reduced them to their true pathetic forms. Hector tightened his finger on the trigger of his pistol and began to count backward from 10 in a loud and booming voice. The countdown echoed off the walls of the dining room. Brian screamed in fresh terror and buried his face deeper into the carpet. Rachel continued to yell at me, demanding that I fix the situation and restore her inheritance immediately. She was completely delusional. The noise was deafening, and the physical danger was at an absolute maximum. The cartel lieutenant reached the number 5. I knew the lethal window was rapidly closing. I needed to send the final physical signal to the federal tactical team waiting in the dark woods outside my windows. I did not speak a single word to my daughter or her husband. I slowly and deliberately lifted my left arm. I turned my wrist and looked down at the face of my heavy gold watch. I watched the second hand sweep across the dial. I simply checked the time. I noted the precise moment that their reign of terror finally expired. I lowered my hand and braced my body against the heavy wooden chair. The countdown from the cartel enforcer reached the number 1. The final second of their false reality ticked away into the darkness. I took a deep breath and prepared for the federal thunder to strike. The countdown reached 1. I did not close my eyes. I did not flinch. The heavy oak front door of my home literally exploded off its hinges. The deafening concussive blast shook the floorboards beneath my feet and shattered the remaining crystal wine glasses on the dining table. Before the splintered wood even hit the hallway floor, the large bay windows in the living room disintegrated inward. A hurricane of broken glass and freezing night air swept through the house. Blinding beams of pure white light cut through the sudden chaos. The tactical flashlights attached to federal assault rifles completely eliminated all shadows in the room. The soft classical symphony was instantly drowned out by the commanding shouts of heavily armed men swarming into my home. My oldest son, Michael, led the primary strike team directly into the dining room. He moved with a terrifying and calculated speed. Hector had less than half a second to react to the breach. He never even had the opportunity to point his suppressed pistol toward the door. 2 federal agents collided with the cartel enforcer like a freight train. They slammed Hector backward over his heavy wooden chair. The suppressed weapon flew from his grip and clattered harmlessly across the hardwood floor. The federal agents pinned the massive killer to the ground and drove a heavy knee into his spine. They locked thick steel handcuffs around his wrists and secured his ankles. The deadliest threat in the room was completely neutralized in exactly 4 seconds. The tactical team immediately shifted their focus to the remaining targets. A federal agent grabbed Brian by the collar of his expensive designer shirt. Brian was still weeping on the floor and offering absolutely zero physical resistance. The agent dragged him backward and slammed him face down onto the carpet. Brian screamed as his arms were wrenched violently behind his back. The cold steel cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. He sobbed and begged the agents to believe that he was a victim. He cried out that Hector was holding him hostage. Michael stood over him and coldly informed him that the federal wiretaps had recorded every single one of his illegal phone calls. The sound of his impending 20-year prison sentence completely broke whatever was left of his pathetic spirit. He buried his face in the carpet and wailed like a child. 2 more agents moved quickly toward Rachel. She was completely paralyzed by the sudden explosion of violence. She stood frozen next to the mahogany table with her hands raised in the air. An agent grabbed her arms and spun her around forcefully. He pushed her against the edge of the granite kitchen island. Rachel gasped as the cold steel handcuffs were clamped onto her wrists. She began to struggle wildly against the restraint. She looked around the chaotic room with wild, panicked eyes. She finally realized that this was not a simple misunderstanding. She realized that her own brother had orchestrated a massive federal raid against her. She looked frantically across the room and locked her eyes directly onto me. She screamed my name. She begged me to tell the federal agents to let her go. She cried out that she was my only daughter and that I needed to protect her. She sobbed that she had made a terrible mistake, but that she still loved me. She pleaded with me to show mercy and save her from prison. Her cries echoed through the ruined dining room over the sound of the agents securing the perimeter. I sat perfectly still in my heavy wooden chair for a long moment. I let the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. The absolute physical danger had passed. The intricate trap had snapped shut with perfect precision. I placed my hands on the armrests and stood up slowly. I did not look like a weak or confused old man anymore. I stood tall and squared my shoulders. I reached up and calmly straightened the collar of my shirt. I adjusted my wool jacket and brushed a small shard of broken glass from my sleeve. I walked slowly around the dining room table. I stepped over the spilled wine and the discarded federal conservation certificate. I walked right past the sobbing form of Brian. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from my daughter. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. She expected to see a loving father ready to forgive her horrific transgressions. She expected the unconditional love she had weaponized against me to save her one last time. I looked down at her with absolutely no emotion. I spoke with a quiet and resonant clarity that cut completely through the noise in the room. I told her that she had no right to ask for my protection. I reminded her of the exact moment she sat in my kitchen and planned to feed me crushed heart medication. I told her that she ceased being my family the very second she measured the value of my life against a payout from a criminal syndicate. I stated that she had chosen her path of greed and betrayal. I informed her that she would now face the absolute consequences of that choice without any financial support or parental mercy from me. Rachel stared at me in absolute horror. The final realization completely crushed her. She realized that I had known everything from the very beginning. She realized that I had intentionally played the part of the fading victim to draw her deeper into the federal snare. She realized that her own supreme arrogance had completely blinded her to the trap. She dropped her head and began to weep uncontrollably. Michael walked over and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. He asked me if I was physically injured. I shook my head and told him I was perfectly fine. He nodded and ordered his tactical team to remove the prisoners from the house. I watched the federal agents drag Hector and Brian out through the ruined front door. I watched them lead my weeping daughter out into the cold night air and place her inside the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the gravel driveway. I turned away from the window and walked into my quiet kitchen. I picked up the broom and began to sweep the broken glass from the floor. 3 months have passed since that violent night. The morning sun is currently shining brightly over my protected 60-acre estate. I am sitting on my back porch drinking a cup of hot black coffee. The air is crisp and clean. The silence is profound and deeply comforting. The legal aftermath of the raid was completely devastating for my enemies. Brian and Rachel are currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities awaiting trial. They are facing over 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and attempted murder. The undeniable video evidence I captured from the attic completely destroyed their defense strategies. They have absolutely no money to hire expensive lawyers because the offshore banking maneuver executed by Paul drained their resources completely. The international money laundering syndicate suffered a massive operational blow. The federal government utilized the intelligence gathered from Hector to seize over $50 million in illegal cartel assets. Hector is currently facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. My son Michael received a massive promotion within the Bureau for orchestrating the flawless takedown of a primary cartel lieutenant. We speak on the phone every single week. He plans to bring his family out to the estate for a long vacation this summer. The Federal Conservation Trust remains completely intact. The land will forever remain a protected sanctuary for the wildlife and the ancient trees. I will live out the rest of my days in this beautiful house surrounded by the absolute peace I fought so hard to secure. Some people might look at my situation and think it is tragic. They might think it is sad that a father had to destroy his own daughter to survive. I do not feel any sorrow. I learned that true family is entirely defined by loyalty and mutual respect. Blood simply means you share biology. It does not guarantee love, and it certainly does not excuse profound evil. I chose to prioritize my own dignity over a toxic and parasitic relationship. I chose to use the tools of my enemies to build a fortress they could never penetrate. My name is Alan, and I refused to be a silent victim in my own home. I refused to let greed extinguish my light. If you are watching this and you feel trapped by the toxic expectations of your own family, please remember my story. Remember that you always possess the power to rewrite the ending of your own narrative. Do not let anyone convince you that your life is a burden. Stand tall and secure your own peace. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think I went too far, or do you think justice was perfectly served? Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal. Stay strong and never underestimate the absolute power of a silent adjustment. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that a biological connection does not guarantee genuine loyalty. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering trust. When the people you sacrificed for decide to measure your worth by the balance of your bank account, you owe them absolutely nothing but the cold consequences of their own greed. Never allow the toxic expectations of ungrateful relatives to force you into becoming a willing victim. Your dignity and your safety are paramount. Sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation is simply stepping aside and allowing the people who betrayed you to completely destroy themselves in a trap of their own making. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to protect your own peace, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and absolute justice.